So we have Kuja on today. He's a world-class throat singer based in Detroit, the amazing musical city of Detroit. And so, how long you been into throat singing? How long you been doing this?
On and off since I was a teenager. I remember for the first time trying when I was probably about 16. I was deep into metal vocals at that time, like a lot of teenagers trying to do false chord and gutturals and power fry and all these different techniques. And that's when I heard on Marco Polo, my favorite artist, Batorek playing, and it blew my mind. At the time, when I took a couple steps to lean in this direction, I used my background in metal vocals to try and transform it in this direction, and it did not go well. I quickly gave myself the assumption that you have to be someone who's trained since you were a child to be able to do this skill. And that just did not end up being correct in the end. But I put it down because of that assumption for several years until I was later in college. And it sparked in me once again when it came back into pop culture through The Hue, through also there's that video of that same guy, Batsort Glanchig, on the mountain in the video famously titled Mongolian Throat Singing. Um, and also in Dune, that was a huge one for pop culture. And the Sardaukar chant was just mind blowing to so many people, including myself. And so when that came back into pop culture, I re-immersed myself into it. So anywhere between, 5 to 8 years, depending on how long you measure, the dedication to it. But throughout that time, I developed this persistence in finding it over and over again, finding something. And that persistence is really what led me in the right direction every single time.
Awesome. So the normal path would be, I mean, say you grew up in Western Mongolia, you're learning as a kid even before your voice changes, correct? And all those techniques are kind of entrenched pretty
Yeah,
early on.
yeah, and that's the interesting thing is that it's not too out of the norm. And if you're someone growing up around that kind of music, you may be able to intuitively grasp these kind of techniques even before asking the questions. But certainly, a lot of these musicians train since they were children. And one of my most insightful teachers of all time, Badi Dorju Ondar from Tuva, he actually was here in the US at 9 years old on the Chevy Chase show. And he was there singing for the American audience in what must have been many people's first exposure to throat singing. And when I was learning from him, I got to ask him, I said, what was that like? You were, how old were you? And he said, oh, I was 9 years old, here in America for the first time. And it was very, very different from his perspective. They were saying things like make the frog noise. And there was a translator there who was kind of being very, very pushy, and as well as the reactions on Chevy Chase's face really gave the impression that this was more of a gimmick. And that has always been something I've battled in this endeavor, was to take something that is so reverent to many cultures, not only just the Mongolian culture, and connected spiritually as well, and to make sure that it does not enter the lens of something like a gimmick, because it can easily get a laugh, it can easily get some different reactions, but in the end this is an element of UNESCO intangible cultural heritage, and something that is right now trying to be preserved throughout a lot of different people's works, and to make sure that those opportunities when people come over and they portray it are perceived in the right lens is really, really important. So even when you start off as a kid and you might actually see a lot of children, especially in Togan culture, who are practicing this, it isn't limited to that starting point. However, it is still very, very important to be perceived in the right context And I think that's something as an American or unfamiliar audience is really, really important. You know, these kids aren't just doing something that is fun and it sounds silly. They're doing something that's very much vital to their culture. And when I asked Badi Ondar about this, and I said, tell us about the difference in how common this style of singing is between cultures. We know that there is still the sing-songy type of singing in Eastern cultures as well. However, throat singing is much more prominent, and he said, "Yeah, everybody does it. It's in all their households in Tuva." So absolutely, there's these kids not only growing up around it, but these kids training in it. And it's because this is such a solidified element to their upbringing and the cultural around them.
Hmm. Yeah, I've seen some videos of people traveling through Tuva, and I got that impression too that it very much is entrenched in the culture, right? It's very much a part of everyday culture. So that's
Absolutely.
incredible. That's incredible. So you made this decision to go down this path and learn this completely new technique and style of singing. How long did it take you to? I mean, I'm sure you saw a little bit of progress pretty quickly, but how long did it take you to really get it under your control?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and especially the important aspect is control. That portion takes several years, and for me, I think the actual control developed about 2 years in. Um, Way before I learned throat singing, way before I learned this instrument here, and many of the other folk instruments, I played guitar, and I've played it for over 10 years now. And I remember the famous quote, it's not how you learn how to play the guitar, it's how not to play the guitar. And that control that you're talking about is the most important aspect. I think a lot of people within 2 or 3 months can develop a foundation for experiencing these styles of throat singing, and I certainly did as well. I would drive to work and it was a little over an hour every day, so I had several hours of just listening to my voice projected back against the windshield. And I developed experience in these techniques within 3 months, but that control was the even more important aspect that took several years, at least two, until I began to actually consciously control it in the way that we'd like to as a musician.
Hmm. And so you're not having to think about it anymore. You're just kind of doing it, and what was your practice routine? So you mentioned driving to work and practicing in the car while you're driving to work. Did you have a practice routine whereby you would do this every single day, correct, to get this under your control?
I would actually. I would do this
Mhm.
every single day on my way to and from work, so it was at least 2 hours there and back. And I would listen to not only my voice a cappella, but a lot of times I'd play whatever folk songs I could find and play them on the radio. And I'd have a playlist and I'd go through them over and over and do my best to not only match the pitch, but the pressure is what I try and show my students is so important in throat singing. The pressure is really what's going to make or break what you're doing with your voice. And I know that this applies to many other styles as well, but we can often become distracted by the very academic aspects of music in terms of pitch or rhythm. And if I could have my students focus on anything first, it would be the pressure. That is what differentiates your capability for the style beyond anything. And that is what that routine taught me. Those 2 hours every single day, it taught me that I needed to have the pressure to be able to even enter into these different techniques. And I would practice on the weekends as well. And it wasn't so fixated. At least I knew for a fact that during the weekday it would be that amount every single day because I was in the car.
And was there a? I'm sure there was an element of frustration in the beginning where I'm not quite getting this. What gave you the temerity to stick through it and push past that point where you just suck?
Yeah, I was aware of how dedicated I was from the very beginning. I had no idea how to play what we call the horsehead fiddle, and I went and I had one made for me and shipped over here, And when you sit there with a new instrument that you have no idea how to play, you're not going to let that go to waste. And so I'm sitting here with all of this expectation I have for myself, and I found that exciting actually. And I found the little steps I did take to be exciting and reassuring enough to know that eventually I would reach the heights that I was aspiring to. Because you can make a, a significant portion of progress in throat singing within the first few months. And I think a lot of people recognize that. And it's beautiful on one side because you can see a whole different characteristic of yourself and your expression that you never have. On the other side, you see a lot of people who have some very confident reactions to that. They say, "Oh, I mastered it within only a couple months," and the control is really the most important aspect that comes afterwards. And so
Mhm.
that confidence that comes from your own awareness will always, from my experience, overtake any sort of frustration that you have with the lack of progress, because this is a style that I think you can gain traction in relatively soon, and you can use that traction as inspiration for yourself to keep going.
So you got to know why you're doing it.
Yeah,
In other words.
absolutely. Yeah, I know that there are a few people who would dabble and, maybe you break it out on a campfire. And so, like you're saying, if you know you're only doing it for that, then you might not have that same drive. However, I heard every single style and continued to be amazed every single time I heard a new style. At the beginning, most people think that there's only three, and then I saw five, six, seven, eight, nine different styles, and every single time it was incredible and made me so excited that I wasn't done. You might have heard something for the first time and you might have done something well, but then you find out there's all this potential, and that really solidifies with inspiration all of your own dedication to what you're doing.
Mhm. So how instantaneous was this switch for you in terms of you heard this new style of singing as a metal enthusiast, you liked it. Was this switch instantaneous, like I'm doing this now, or was it gradual? Did it kind of take a while in terms of making
You
that
know
decision?
what? It was very instantaneous. It's funny that
Mm,
that was the word that you used because that's very much how it felt. I felt like it was night and day, really, and it was in terms of tonality and just experience of a listener to go from a mostly metal-based background in terms of alternative vocals into this style. All of my songs I play every single day shifted to folk songs, and that changed so much. There's, of course, the deduction of metal in terms of, you know, what characteristics are you giving the listener in terms of, their life and what they're perceiving. And that changes certainly in totality. The themes of all these folk songs instead focus on the beauty around them and not the hardship and the reverence for the land, the reverence for the ancestors or things that shaped their upbringing. And that can certainly alter not only your perspective, but also your dedication. Suddenly, you're not shaped by that hardship and the energy that emerges as a result, you are actually shaped by the upliftment. And that is a very, very different kind of inspiration that you're dealing with. I think that there's a lot that can be used from those feelings of hardship that is associated with metal music. And you can certainly get yourself riled up and do some incredible vocals. If you can do the opposite and relax and do some incredible vocals and feel in harmony with your surroundings, you will find that not only the outlook on your own experience as an artist changes, but also the outlook of the world around you will as well.
mhm. Yeah, and this isn't, it's like learning a language in a sense because not only are you adopting new vocabulary and new techniques, but it's like you're adopting a whole new culture and everything that goes into that, correct? You know,
Absolutely.
mixing the songs and yeah.
And that's not, like you're saying, it's not even voluntary at that point. You really are adopting the culture to an extent that it, it's not optional. And this is where that respect comes into play because you begin participating in something that is so big that has been shaped for hundreds and hundreds of years. And what do you do with it is the next question that the practitioners should ask themselves, because I have seen very many times it used in a funny and entertaining way. And that's it's still an element of continuing on the heritage. But that was never the original intent. And that should also be mindful, inside of the focus of the practitioner, because spirituality and connection and harmony with the world around you was very, very much products of this style, and not only products but also things that shaped it in the very beginning. So
Uh-huh.
each style generally follows under these similar stories. The lower style generally comes from either the nomads imitating the animals around them, like the camels and their grunts, or in the literal translation of the Mongol word "hakra," which is the rapids of the water. They have a very rumbling essence to it. And as well, if you move to Tula and you ask someone there, teach me the style, I'm told by the teachers of the Lash that the Tula masters will sit you before a mountain and they'll say, "Look at the mountain. Now do it." And it's beautiful, you can see in the visualization of that example what you're actually doing. And I think it's absolutely incredible to break things down into their starting points, because you can understand to greater extent how these styles developed. The mountain is widest at its base, and that is certainly where that style brings its foundation. It's narrowest at its tip, just like you're doing with your chest and in a little bit of your throat as well. And so these styles all come from what they observed around them. Home, the middle style, was also known to be a warrior that rested in the grass and listened to the wind and imitated the wind and used his lips and his mouth to until he could imitate the wind itself. And same with the higher styles, where they listened to the birds and they imitated the bird calls to an extent that implemented the wind as well. And that's even more fascinating too, because they all blend together in one way or another. So they heard a bird call and they thought, okay, I can try and get close to that. And they built off one another. But they all came from the world around them. And that is the most incredible part. There are so many different inspirations today because of the way we see it used and the way that it can be used. There's a lot of people who ask, hey, can I use this for a sample? Can I use this in a rap song, an EDM song? And that's incredible. And it actually helps propagate what has been created. But it's also incredible to see where it comes from and the creativity in the originators of this style to be able to become familiar with parts of your body and use them in order to imitate the sounds around you. That's also incredible too. It's very, very much worth understanding as the practitioner.
Hmm. Yeah, so these techniques and these sounds are based on real things, not just from a vacuum, correct? And
Yeah,
I see you in
absolutely.
your videos, you're playing outside a lot in the woods surrounding Detroit, correct?
Yeah,
I mean, what kind
absolutely.
of inspiration do you draw from nature, playing music outside and actually being surrounded by the real sounds you're trying to imitate?
I draw the inspiration of the very things that shape this style, the even the rhythmic aspects. There are a lot of beautiful sounds if you just sit in the woods quietly for a while and you hear these rhythmic aspects, maybe they're branches swaying, maybe it's a woodpecker, and these can actually shape what you're doing either consciously or unconsciously playing in the woods. And even the weather is incredible in a way that it shapes the instrument. And a lot of people see this as a bad thing and they say, oh, I'm out of tune suddenly. But for hundreds of years, people playing the horsehead fiddle in the steppes would not tune to an app or a device that they had, they tuned to one another. And what caused the tuning of their instrument? Well, the temperature around them. And it was really their surroundings that shaped the music. And just like that word that we talked about earlier, "Harra," the rapids of the water, it was these sounds around them that shape the music that they're playing. So when I sit in the woods and I listen, it can make me create something that I wouldn't have indoors because taking all that in can only bolster what you were trying to do in the first place. It'll create something entirely new, something organic and natural, and it doesn't have to conform to the academic standards that we have in terms of music, especially in orchestral style. It can deviate in terms of tempo, even pitch, or even key, depending on what you're listening to. Birds can have a certain melody in their chirps that you can play along with, and so do many other sounds. And that's the beauty of it, is that unpredictable aspect of the world around you coming into harmony using your improvisation. And that is certainly where I, as a musician, grew the most, was by learning and working with improvisation.
Hmm. And I see you outside even in the winter, and that's a big part of it too, is just spending a lot of time outside and gaining inspiration that way, correct? Because and that's what the music's based on. Yeah. Fascinating.
Absolutely. And it's really great too when you talk about inspiration because that's not something that we really commonly do unless you're going sledding or skiing. There's a very narrow element in terms of our own activities that we do in the winter. And
Hmm.
so it's something as a musician I would always recommend experiencing. Sitting out in the winter stillness has a timbre to the world around you that you would not have heard going outside at any other season. The snow is an insulator, and that crafts this unique dynamic to the sounds around you, even that you're playing. And the temperature of the air, yes, can modify your instrument and you can tune it the way you want, but it also affects you as a player. And I remember there was a story in the book Free Play, The Art of Improvisation. And the author was talking about a time when he lived in an apartment and he could only practice at night with his violin. And so that meant he had to be really quiet and didn't want to wake up his roommates. So he played his violin so quietly. And at first, he really, really struggled and he got frustrated with that. And as you can imagine, it's not easy playing, especially a bowed instrument at a quiet pace. You really need to have an excessive amount of control available at all times. And that's what he said he developed. And that experience, that hardship of being there on his own, being there trying to play quietly in his room at night, that created a control he wouldn't have otherwise had. Similarly, if you're out in the freezing cold air in the winter, you have to play with this level of control that you wouldn't have elsewhere. It demands more of you. And as a result of that demand, you can create something that you otherwise would not have. In harmony with the tonality of a blanket of snow beneath you, it will make a sound, even in a practice piece that you hadn't heard before. And that is the real value of it.
Hmm. Yeah, because there's a lot of types of music that you could say are based on nature, classical, Western classical music, for example, which I play, but it's a somewhat removed from nature in the sense that we spend our time inside indoors practicing these instruments and then play them indoors, but the composers themselves, like Beethoven, for example, were walking through the woods and getting inspiration. So there is that basis, you know. So I think it's important to remember that, right? But bass in the throat singing tradition, are there seasons are important, correct? I mean, do we have a tradition of songs based around summer versus winter and so on and so forth?
Absolutely, and even the events themselves being held in these different seasons have their own respective traditions, especially when it comes to, in Mongolian culture, the urtindu, which is translated to either ancient song or long song, depending on the context of the length. These urtindu have rites, and these rites are characteristic of how you're going to be playing the song. What is the context? What is the occasion? And these occasions can vary from festivals to weddings, statehood rights, and things associated with your own surroundings, whether it be a tribe or your own country. And of course, the seasons will determine when these different events happen, and therefore these urtindu are played at different times of the year, are played in different events, and it's very, very important for all these events to have this piece at the beginning. And it is something to be observed with reverence and understanding for its purpose, because these events are essentially established because of the piece. And that was so important. I had the honor to work with my good friend Erica for the first throat singing workshop that I did in a large group of people. And he said, before we begin, I need to play this Ortindu for us. And it talks about the likelihood of us all being here. And the song describes, in a Buddhist context, essentially, as a primarily Buddhist country, Mongolia is, what are the karmic leads that led every single person in this room to be here in this moment? What is the likelihood each of us would be here? And this Urtindu, this piece, allows the audience to reflect upon that. There are no words. However, this expression is portrayed through the mud horn, through the horsehead fiddle, and through those notes being played. And that component to open any sort of event, especially there, was so important because it brought out a piece of reflection in everyone, an introspection that otherwise would not have been there. And it made the occasion so much more valuable. If you open up any opportunity with thinking, what is the likelihood that you're actually here? Imagine how much better your mundane meetings in day-to-day life could be. It's really, really incredible. And it makes you realize, the importance of why these pieces are played when they're played. And I think those traditions are absolutely incredible. And if we could have more of that in the West, it would be so beneficial. These moments of reflection, these moments of reverence, not only for the occasion itself, but for the participants of the occasion. And so, absolutely, the different times and places can shape exactly what you're playing.
Yeah, beautiful. That was beautifully put. And again, I just want to reiterate how striking it was just to see you out in the snow playing your instrument and singing. I mean, it was just, you don't see that very often. So it's an incredible sight and it reflective of the music, I think. And I was just wanted to ask you, are you still developing your voice and what kind of routine do you have? What kind of practice routine do you have around that?
Absolutely. I do whatever I can every single day to learn and grow. And a lot of it centers around what we discussed earlier, control, and building a heightened sense of bodily awareness. There's a lot of elements of throat singing that contain muscles, parts of your body that we do not yet have conscious control of. And the more that you fixate or become aware of different portions of the body, the better you can get at controlling in a more dynamic way. And so every day I'm trying to visualize and see different parts, especially throughout the chest and the esophagus, that I haven't yet used. There's a very, very uncommon in comparison to other styles of throat singing. style in tuba called Chilandik, and it is the oh, or I'm sorry, this is Chilandik is what I'll use in combination in this example. It's called Isinglir, and it is named after the sound of stirrups on a saddle clicking. And I'm going to use it in the example with a style called Chilandik, which is all three tones at once, the fundamental, the undertone, and the overtone. And essentially, it is the opening and closing of the soft palate. And that is something that we would never think to use in any style of singing. And I only ever once heard someone talk about using it in yoga. You're laying down for shavasana, and the teacher said, yawn almost and raise your soft palate. That's really interesting. I didn't really think that that was something I could use. This connection, the medical word phellum, between your nose and your mouth. And I become aware of this style named Isinglir, where it's open and closed at will. And that is certainly not something that anybody can do off the top of their head. And so, what it requires the practitioner to do is see a part of their body and become aware of it first, and then develop it as an actual tool. And so, first, you have to simply visualize parts of your body. What does it look like? This piece that connects my nose to my mouth. And what might that look like if it was opening and closing? And there might be one day where you feel something and you're like, that was it. And, okay, now remember, what did that feel like? And you go back and you go back. And eventually, you might create the sound and the rhythmic quality that you hear to. And you feel something that you've never felt before. And that is incredible. So every single day I try to learn about a part that I have not yet used. Because once you develop that toolkit, you can create much more with much more tools. And all your tools are already within you. We just need to recognize that they're there. We have this vast toolbox sitting right next to us, and we see the top drawer, and we're like, all right, I have my Phillips and my flathead, and this is how I'm gonna sing. And we don't realize we have this torque bit, and we have this ratchet, and all these other tools that are right beneath it. And that is very much the case with many of my students. Is they're familiar with here, the very back of their throat, and they often lose their voice or they sound like they're choking because this is what they're familiar with and what they can actively control. And the difference between a beginner and a seasoned practitioner is the utilization of their body. And you'll find that there's a lot higher concentration of muscles being used in experienced throat singers because they've found much more ways to develop this pressure, to develop these tones, other than the small amount that we know already. And so every single day I try to learn to be mindful of much more of my body. And that mindfulness will differentiate the beginner from the experienced throat singer.
Okay, so you need to visualize a possibility and then you develop an exercise around that possibility in order to develop that muscle. And do you work on those exercises every day or is it kind of, more of a visualization thing?
It is both, it is a beginning of that visualization every single day to try and remember what you're aiming for, to try and remember what the end product is. The end product is all of you, is putting your whole self into this. And from one perspective, that sounds like too much. It sounds like you're using way more than you need to, when in reality, it's the opposite. If there's one very, very heavy crate and one man carries that heavy crate, he's going to put in a lot of work. But if you have several different men carrying that heavy crate, they're actually going to be doing less work between one another. And that is what we want throughout our body as well as the practitioner. We want to be able to create the same music and diversify our assets that we're using to create it. And so we can start with these visualization exercises and then build off different practices that allow us to become familiar with what we're doing. And in the end, it makes what we're doing as a musician so much more effortless because we've allowed so much more of ourself to create the end product rather than restricting from this narrow lens how we're going to do it and what we were familiar with in the past. And that all starts with that practice of mindfulness and awareness.
Okay. And talk about the ear a little bit. So I can imagine that you have to have a finely tuned ear to sing this style well, meaning sing in tune and then hear the overtones and sing those well in tune, correct? And how do you develop your ear?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I think that there's not as much conscious aspect to developing the ear as we might expect. And there is an element of organic growth that comes with your own fixation on the elements that you're looking towards. So, for example, overtones. The more that you fixate on someone else's overtones, the better you are to hear yours. And I certainly remember a time when I was emerging into this style, looking at different videos and wondering, was that the overtone? Was this? And that wonder, that sense of curiosity and uncertainty forces you to fixate on what you're looking for, this frequency spectrum that's higher than what we're used to. Our fundamental tone is really the sound of our voice, and those overtones are only small elements and or potentials within that fundamental tone that are just being isolated in the mix. And so just as a producer would gain more familiarity to their mids or their treble in the piece as they put their attention to it, so do we as the practitioner. The more we listen to others, the more we try and put our attention towards those areas, the more that we organically grow accustomed to them. And I certainly found after a while, I could realize elements, nuances in people's overtones that I didn't hear before when I started. There might be sudden fluctuations, there might be rhythmic qualities. Beforehand, they might have sounded consistent, and now there's this dynamic expression. And that really comes from your own ability to hear a broader spectrum. And that ability really comes from your own attention to it. And so if you don't have a whole lot of attention to it and you listen just for the basics, just for the underlying melody, and the underlying progression of the song, you're going to miss out on those. And it depends on how fixated you are, because the more you become aware of those nuances, the more that you hear them in yourself. And when you begin to hear them, then you can work on them and you can tell yourself where I want to go. One of my favorite things from your pages was the musician who said the the brain controls the meat does not control the brain.
Yeah.
And man, does that have a profound effect on people in their practice? You know, when you visualize, when you're able to visualize, and of course, we're talking about audio at this point, but when you're able to think about that note that you want your overtone to be at, you move towards it in a subconscious way, in an intuitive way, versus before trying to mess around until you get to that amount. And that's the real distinction between the two.
So listening a lot and listening deeper, right? So that's how you learned, right? You were listening all the time to a lot of different singers, different songs, different, yeah, different sub styles within this broader style, correct? So you were just fully immersed and really, really listening. So how deep can you listen, correct? So
Yeah, and
yeah,
and the more you raise a good point about style too, because in search terms, when you type in throat singing, typically Mongolian is the word that follows or is the precursor, and there's several countries, several continents that engage in this. Yes, there is Mongolian throat singing. There's also Tuvan throat singing, and then people might know about the Altai throat singing, and then people might be familiar with more Western styles towards Vikings and the Germans, and there's also Inuit throat singing, Katachak, and this is actually only carried out by the women in their culture. Men never engage in it. But it all started in that same place, from imitating nature. And actually, in Katachak, in the Inuit practice, the women clasp arms and they stare at each other in the eyes throughout the whole practice, and they both imitate different animal sounds, and it progresses naturally building off one another. It's never the same every single time. And this practice is so indicative of what we're talking about, the quality of listening, and that will enable you as the musician to have a better quality result because they listen to these animals, they listen to their calls, they listen to their expressions, and then they were able to imitate those nuances and build off of one another. And I'd highly recommend looking up this Inuit throat singing if anybody ever has the opportunity because it is an experience unlike you've seen before, and it's never repeatable because these two women always build off one another, always create something new. And that is active in your listener as the other person. They go back and forth. And that's just absolutely beautiful because it is their own ability as the practitioner to listen that grants the experience. They listen not only to nature to find those sounds, but listen to the partner that they're repeating from. And like you're saying, the more quality of listening that you have, the better quality product that you can also output as the musician.
Hmm. And how important is that for you just being outside, being in nature, and you don't have headphones on, you're not listening to a podcast or anything, you're just out there absorbing the sounds around you. That must be an important part of what you do, right?
Absolutely. It's incredibly important. And I think that whatever perception that you can have of the natural world will enable you to create a much better result. I know that this is not always as easily digestible as someone like a piano player. However, we both have a window and we can see the trees growing. And there is absolutely harmony evident in the world around us that can be implemented in what you're doing. The golden ratio is in the proportions of the tree and the branches, and this sort of mathematical relationship is always going to exist in the music that we play too. And even if it's not a conscious unraveling of your observations, even by looking out your window to any of the nature around you, you're going to have a perception of this organic harmony. And that organic harmony is really what we're looking to produce as these musicians. We're looking to produce something that is indicative of the world around us because that's where it came from. And we're looking to really try and emphasize those qualities because it is a celebration after all. It is a celebration of how these qualities were made, and we're looking to give that reverence to the audience as well. And what better way to do that than to be in that same state of harmony that the world around us is in? So even if it is just looking out the window or listening to the sounds of the rain while you play, it is so important that you learn to have the improvisation with nature because it's a conversation as a musician unlike any conversation you'll have with another human. It's much more intimate.
Yeah, incredible. And that was so beautifully said. And in terms of the instruments you play to accompany yourself, what kind of practicing goes into that? I mean, how many different instruments do you play? There's a few, correct?
Yeah, there are a few. Most commonly, besides my in Mongol, this is ikish, uh, thought to be derived from ikish, great language, and this is a more ancient style of horse head fill here. And the other Mongolian instrument that I play is dovshor, which is the Mongolian lute, and that is fretless. Shortly afterwards, I got top shur from the Altai, which is fretted and has more circular, ovalish shaped body. And those are key to most of my performances because they give not only the rhythmic but also harmony fluctuations that the throat singer can accompany. I have a shaman drum and a Mongol interdental flute, sur, as well, but these instruments are very common in terms of the practitioner of throat singing to accompany what he's doing if he's not only using his voice alone, which is also very common in tone practice.
Hmm. So you have to have a routine around that and build the technique on those particular instruments as well, just to because that's a whole other thing, right? From training your voice.
Absolutely.
So,
And,
yeah.
you know, the routine or practice that I have and the routine or practice that I recommend is actually not to have one. And the beauty of that is that you always sit down to play and you don't sit down to practice. I remember growing up around so many people that were incredible musicians and they played their instruments better than I did my own. And they hated sitting down to practice.
Yeah.
I said, why don't you just play? And they would have a great time. And they would be doing the same thing, you know, they would be playing the songs that they would need to grow in. But their approach was different. It wasn't militant, it wasn't academic. They sat down to have a conversation with the instrument. You know, when we think about just the nomenclature itself, if you sit down with a child, you know, they don't say, do you want to have a conversation? Do you want to hang out? You know, they say, do you want to play? And that's who we're looking to be with in order to foster that quality of inspiration. We gain almost all of our inspiration from that fascination, from that excitement that we had as a child. And so if we can sit down and play our instruments instead of practice it, our output from that practice will be so much better. It will be a practice. We're sitting down doing the same thing. But if we cannot practice a day in our life and play every day, then we will gain so much more. And that just comes from your awareness and approach. And your result will be completely different. And the only way to experience that is just by trying it yourself. Using different words could create a completely different sort of repertoire in whatever you're trying to learn. And it makes things organic, approachable, and much more enjoyable as a musician too, even to just use a different word.
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of being a musician is trying to remember why we started in the first place, right? Just like you said. So, and when you perform, what's going through your head? What are you thinking about?
You know, I often try to find a point higher up in the room, much higher than the heads of the audience, and I try to remember. And this is very much in alignment with what you started with because we are not performing for the money originally. We didn't start playing for most of us for the money. We didn't start playing for the certain individuals that are in the crowd. We started playing for that original ambition, for that original inspiration. And if we can grasp that again as we play, it will show. And I think there is merit to responding to an audience, but there is, in my opinion, much more merit to responding to your own origins as a musician and engaging with them. And when you sit back and you can find a way to engage in that reflection, it will show in what you're doing because they will hear why you began doing it. And that is a very, very common technique for me. And it allows me to be happy about what I'm doing in that moment and to be grateful. Here I am doing what I wanted to do when I first started. I'm not here doing something scary. I'm not here being nervous around a crowd of people. I'm not here concerned about my mistakes. I'm here doing what I set out to do. And that will absolutely be observed from the audience. And there's nothing more rewarding if you've been one of the people in the crowd to one of those artists to witness that gratitude in a musician as they hit the right note, as they do the signature bend that they developed through years absolutely perfectly, as the bow of their violin moves just the right speed as they wanted, and you see it on their face, the gratitude in what they just did. That makes the experience so much better as an observer too. So why not find some way to do that in yourself? And for me, that oftentimes involves looking above what I'm doing, literally and figuratively. But you can do it very well by simply just looking it up.
Man, that's amazing. And incredible. So there's one more question for you, and I just wanted to ask about the city of Detroit. You born and raised in Detroit?
I'm born and raised in Detroit. I've always been around Metro Detroit. I was born in Dearborn, but when you are raised in Metro Detroit, the culture is immersive everywhere that you go.
Oh, yeah,
And Motown is in the blood of every single person that walks the streets, and the
yeah,
legacy of it, and even the sort of contagious energy of creativity. It is so apparent in so many different walkways. Even in I was sitting in a cafe, and it was actually a lawyer who approached me and started talking. Oh yeah, my son is a flute player, and he actually plays over the orchestra. And man, we had these roots over here and here, and it was incredible that I had this interaction with this stranger who was a lawyer by trade, not a musician, didn't play music at all, but that was the bond that we had. He recognized me as a musician, and his son was one. And this is very, very common around Detroit, and the support is incredible. As a result, because we have that foundation, we have a solid system of support for musicians. And that means that people can do what they want to as a creative, as an artist, as someone using music, and feel uplifted and feel like they're doing something that is worthwhile. It always is, as you and I both know, but at least being surrounded by that means everything.
yeah. I always wondered about Detroit because there's so much amazing music that came out of there, and it seems like this kind of out of the way place in a sense, being from the coasts.
Yeah,
But you just wonder. But I guess it's just in the air, right? It's in the atmosphere. The
absolutely. And
yeah.
and it's really, really funny. Like there is a reputation that precedes anything musically. Kiss saying Detroit Rock City, like it comes up in so many different ways. It comes up in Motown, it comes up in Aretha Franklin, it comes up in Eminem, and yet there is very, very little participation and observation from outside cities because of what you're saying. It kind of seems like an out of the way place. But if I could encourage anybody, I would, because it is an experience unlike any other, and it is a very, very faithful and truthful group of people to what they're doing. It isn't often that people will move to Detroit actually to create their music. However, the musicians who are here in Detroit are determined and loyal to it, and they bolster that reputation that we had with new things, and the community around them will always uplift them in what they're doing. And that is the most rewarding part of being here as a musician.
Yeah, and people that are from Detroit love Detroit. That's what I've always found,
Right.
like, and that's just amazing because unfortunately, it can have a bad reputation, and for some, and people associate it with decay and whatnot. But the people that are from Detroit don't feel that way, right? They don't.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And it's funny, I even hear a lot of people who are like, they're like, Shh, don't tell anybody, like keep it a secret because
yeah,
it's actually a great city to live in. It's a great city to be in. I have a
yeah.
friend
Hmm.
who's moving to Detroit right now in downtown, and a lot of people aren't aware of the great livelihood that it has. And a lot of Detroit people, they will vocalize that, but they're okay with not other people knowing it because it's our own little gem that we have here in Michigan. And if you do get the opportunity to come down, everybody will just love that you shared in this priceless piece that we have. And
Hmm.
it's not often that we hear someone, oh yeah, I wanted to travel to Detroit just to experience it. And you can come up to strangers, they'll be like, oh, let me show you this, let me show you that. There's all these little places around that you can gain just incredible experiences from, not only as a musician, but especially as one too.
Yeah, and there's quite a resurgence happening there. That's what I've heard. The downtown area is incredible nowadays, and it looks beautiful. All those old buildings have been restored, and
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, Kuja, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. This was extremely enlightening and uplifting, and I think our audiences will definitely benefit from it. And I really, really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Nick. I love the opportunity. I
Yeah,
appreciate
and
all the work.
check out Kuja's Instagram page and his website, which is
The Throat Singer,
The Throat Singer.
thethroatsinger.com. That's
The
fine.
Throat's amazing, amazing. Check out thethroatsinger.com. He's all over different types of media. So yeah, check it out. And thanks again for the time, Kuja.
Thank you so
Appreciate it.
much, Nick. I appreciate it.